AIDS epidemic struck, it was assumed that American science would soon discover the cause of this terrifying new disease.
Today, we add another miracle to the long honor roll of American medicine and science.
I would like to turn now to the eminent scientist who has made the breakthrough which promised the conference today. We call upon Dr. Robert Gallo with applause and appreciation.
We now have produced more than 50 isolates.
It is April 1984. For Robert Gallo, this is the crowning achievement of a distinguished career. With many discoveries to his credit, Dr. Gallo has long been at the top of human virology. When AIDS was first recognized as a serious epidemic, it seemed likely that it was caused by a virus. Dr. Gallo soon became involved in the search for a cure. But to find a cure, you must first find the cause. Dr. Gallo had a hunch that the cause might be related to a virus which he had discovered in 1978, HTLV, a rare type of virus called a retrovirus, never before seen in humans. As the international scientific community discussed it, it seemed that there were good reasons to suppose that HTLV might be involved. Dr. Gallo's hunch was backed by the funding might of America.
The National Institutes of Health, NIH. All by itself, this magnificent institution stands as the most brilliant social institution of the 20th century, anywhere.
Dr. Gallo was made head of the group in NIH, which dealt with AIDS research. The AIDS effort is the largest single scientific enterprise ever launched. All over the world, scientists labor to conquer the disease, and none more so than those at NIH. The AIDS research of Gallo's lab is quoted more than any other. When the AIDS virus was isolated, it gave rise to a test around which was to grow a multi-million-dollar industry. Dr. Gallo himself is recognized by NIH and by the US Patent Office as the discoverer of the virus and the originator of the test. His career had been festooned with prizes and fame. To many, he was the person who had done most to launch the battle against AIDS. At first, only a small group in France dissented from that opinion. In August 1985, one of them arrived in New York. He came from the Institut Pasteur, the home of French AIDS research, and he was about to set in motion an international scientific dispute. He was the director of the institute himself. His name was Raymond Dedondère. And Monsieur Dedondère was angry. He had engaged a firm of lawyers to challenge the US Patent Office. He was on his way to tell his lawyers a story about the discovery of the AIDS virus. But his story was very different from the one which America had been told. For one thing, it involved completely different people. And for another, it began in Paris. In 1982, a young French fashion designer reported to a Paris hospital complaining of swollen glands. He happened to be seen by one of the few doctors who at that time was familiar with the new disease, AIDS, so his symptoms were taken very seriously. This patient and the cause of his disease are vital to our story. He wished to remain anonymous, so he is known only by the initials B.R.U. Bru. The doctors reasoned that if Brue was in the early stages of AIDS, his swollen glands could very well be full of whatever caused the disease. The doctor's hypothesis was that a virus was involved. In order to try to find one, Brue was prepared for an operation to remove one of the lymph glands from his neck.
At the beginning of '82, the viral hypothesis became more and more accurate because the sexual transmission was identified, and also the blood transfusion. And if we look at other disease transmitted by sexual route or IV route or blood transfusion, the most probable is a virus. So at the beginning of '82, we begin to work on the viral hypothesis.
Brue's lymph gland was taken across Paris to the only virus scientists in France that Dr. Rosenbaum had managed to interest in the problem. The disease was not well known at that time. It was thought to affect only minorities. AIDS research was not fashionable. But Dr. Rosenbaum had managed to form a small French group. Like Dr. Gallo, they were following the hunch that a retrovirus was involved. Perhaps it was even the original HTLV itself, the very virus Gallo had discovered. The search for a retrovirus began as the French started to work on Brue's lymph gland. The cells were separated out and broken apart chemically. Then they were centrifuged, so that the particles of virus were thrown to the bottom of a test tube. Although they had yet to prove it, there, for the first time, anywhere in the world, was an isolate of the virus which causes AIDS. The virus was cultured in cells and tested for the enzyme which is the unique sign of a retrovirus. First results showed that the enzyme was present. But then the cells started to die. The culture could only be saved by feeding it more cells. The process started again. The enzyme reappeared. There was a retrovirus in Brue's blood. But the big surprise was that it appeared to be quite different from HTLV, the one that Gallo had discovered. HTLV caused a cancer. It made a cell culture grow and replicate forever. This one seemed like a new kind of retrovirus. It killed infected cells.
HTLV 1 or 2, instead to kill the cells, this virus immortalizes the cells.
We had every Saturday a meeting in my office, and everybody was bringing more data which was fitting with the idea that this virus was quite new, very different from HTLV, and was the cause of AIDS.
We verify the difference by calling Dr. Gallo at the NIH that he will provide us, for providing us some reagent directed against the HTLV1. We have seen that it was completely different. At the end of January '83, we knew that it was different.
This was the end of the first part of Monsieur Didonder's story. As he spoke to the lawyer, he stressed that from the very beginning, the French knew that the virus was not the same as Gallo's celebrated HTLV. It was not even, as Gallo was arguing, a close relative. Why, the lawyer asked? If the French discovery was so important, didn't the scientific world acknowledge this achievement straight away? The answer is that in science, as in everything else, it is not enough to be right. One must be able to present one's case in the right way.
At this time, we have characterized that it was a retrovirus. And Bob Gallo at this time tell us that is good, because in May, it will be a special issue of the scientific newspaper, and if you want, it will be a room for you.
It was a rush to get the paper ready. The team was hampered by the need to translate their discovery into another language.
The patient was a 33-year-old homosexual male.
But the language of science is English, and the world appears to be most willing to notice discoveries in English.
For cervical lymphadenopathy.
Le nouveau rétrovirus reporté ici apparaît alors différent du virus HTLV.
The new retroviruses reported here appear to be different. Non, mais non, vous voyez, il n'y a pas d'S. Different from HTLV2.
The tone of the paper was low-key, but there was no doubt that the group were disagreeing with Gallo's theory that the cause of AIDS was his HTLV.
Gallo told us that he will be the referee for the paper. Then we sent the paper to Dr. Gallo, but it's true, we forgot to do the summary of the abstract.
No scientific paper can be published without an abstract.
Gallo called me on the phone telling me that I forgot about the abstract, and Gallo suggested he could write it for me. He read me on the phone an abstract which was very much different from our thinking about HTLV. In this abstract, he said the virus was HTV1. So we had some argument on the phone, but finally I accepted most of the modification he suggested.
When the paper was published, it scarcely caused even a ripple of interest in the world of research. The edition of Science for May the 20th, 1983, contains 3 other papers by Gallo's team claiming that AIDS was caused by a close relative of HTLV. Gallo was convinced that the French data supported this thesis. The summary at the beginning of the French paper could be read as if the paper was merely providing confirmation of Gallo's claim.
I was a little disappointed by. I didn't understand why Gallo was pushing so fast, so far, so strongly the idea of HTLV1, because we had some data very much against this. But finally, I didn't say no.
The French group were disappointed, but they did not despair. They persevered with their research, and over the next months, they made another key discovery. They were able to show that the virus attacked only the body's so-called T helper cells. These were the very cells that were not present in patients with AIDS. There could be no doubt now. Convinced that this time they would be given the recognition they deserved, they sent the paper direct to the British magazine Nature. Nature prides itself on its history of publishing great discoveries first. They felt it was a fitting place for the paper that would leave no doubt about the significance of their work.
This paper, which was sent to Nature, was a superb piece of scientific investigation. It had all the necessary elements there and data to convince even the ignorant that the virus they isolated was a new human virus, that it was involved in the development of AIDS, and even the title of it even told us that the virus, by killing the helper T cells, it explained the mechanism how AIDS developed. So it was a superb piece of investigative research.
It is the report of the referees which decides whether or not the paper is published.
Well, it was rejected. There were two referees, as usual, and one referee said, well, you should be careful, your virus might be a contamination, laboratory contamination, a mouse virus, and we laughed with some bitterness because we already proven that this virus induced antibody, the patient had antibody against the virus, it could not be a laboratory contamination.
It was completely crazy.
The French group also tried to present their case at conferences. They were faced with a double problem. They were relatively unknown as scientists, and as yet, nobody else had even tried to confirm their results by repeating their experiments.
We are trying to fight scientifically in the meeting and so on, but always we have against us the American team, because the American teams were not believing us. I think that is a story.
This is not just a story about a dispute between scientists over who got the credit for what work. Only when the true cause of the disease was recognized would a test be possible. Without that test, AIDS would continue to spread unchecked.
Everything which could have been done before was delayed by a year, namely testing for infected individual was delayed by a year. The understanding of the causation and the transmission of the virus was delayed by a year. Namely, not only people became unnecessarily infected with contaminated blood for a whole year, which means tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, became unnecessarily infected due to the chain reaction, but also people who didn't know that the virus was readily transmitted also by heterosexual contact. By delaying the information, there were many more unnecessary heterosexual transmission of the virus.
Much of 1983 passed with the French voice still unheard. They realized that their best hope was to try to convince Dr. Gallo. In September of 1983, a sample of bruised virus had made its journey across the Atlantic in a suitcase. There was no response from Dr. Gallo.
I know Gallo from '67. I mean, it's not from today, okay? And I tried to convince Gallo that we were right, because convincing Gallo, we will be recognized, okay? And in November, it was a meeting in Seyac. We decided to bicycle for 10 kilometers, and we were speaking, and I explained all the things, saying, we have the virus, be careful, the virus is the cause of AIDS, we know that. And I said, our next meeting will be in Park City. But please, believe me, believe us, we have the virus. In the swimming pool, like that. I don't know if it was joking or I don't know. He told me that he made a mistake. He was believing that he was Oswald Jarrett, William Jarrett from Glasgow. But I was in the water.
Dr. Gallo maintains that it was simply a case of good-humored mistaken identity. But the incident probably didn't improve relations at the time. During the next few months, Dr. Gallo announced to a few colleagues that he had isolated an example of the virus that causes AIDS. He was calling it HTLV-3. Now there was progress in the world of AIDS research. The French had a test, Gallo had a test, and there was even another test, developed at the American Center for Disease Control. It was time to put all three tests to the test.
I had made up a group of specimens from AIDS patients and lymphadenopathy and gay men and transfusion-associated cases, the donor, the recipient, really a remarkable group of specimens, sent them to the three laboratories, to Bob Gallo's laboratory, to the laboratory that I coordinated at CDC, and to the Institut Pasteur. And I sent them all blindly, and only I had the code. And so I sent them out and asked them to send the results back, and then I would see how they all came out. So we went to the Institut Pasteur with that coded list and went down with a finger on the results into the three labs, specimen by specimen, and you could see that the Institut Pasteur Bob Gallow's lab and the CDC lab essentially all had identical results, showing that AIDS patients were infected and people not exposed to HIV or not exposed to the AIDS risk were not infected, that the donor was infected and the recipient was infected, that we had almost all of the information necessary to really show that HIV caused AIDS. So that HIV called LAB at that time caused AIDS.
So the French had been on the right track. The virus they had isolated from Brou a year earlier was the AIDS virus. Now 3 different tests showed identical results. By far the most likely explanation was that all the tests were looking at the same type of virus, the one the French had identified. This was the breakthrough point. Work could begin on halting the spread and finding a cure.
Well, it was a wonderful event. Jean-Claude and Francoise said, let's go out to have a celebration that we've discovered the cause of AIDS. All of us together in a very collaborative spirit. We sat and drank champagnes and all this typical old French entertainment. Was delightful, and lots of champagne flowed, and we had seemingly on the surface a very good time, all the 3 groups working together. What was happening behind the scenes was very interesting. Actually, in that Paradis Latin, Jean-Claude and Bob Gallo went to the men's room to drain out some of the champagne going in the other end. And as they were sitting there at the pissoir, it's been related to me by Jean-Claude that Bob Gallo said, now look, Jean-Claude, I think we can do it together. Pasteur and National Cancer Institute, we can do it. We don't need CDC, which is my organization. Then at breakfast the next morning at the hotel where Bob and I were staying, we had breakfast together, and Bob said to me, me not knowing what he had said to Jean-Claude the evening before, said, Don, I think CDC and the National Cancer Institute can do this together. We don't need Institut Pasteur. I should have understood and had more import, given more import to that than I did.
Only 2 weeks after the Paris meeting, Margaret Heckler, Secretary of State for Health, announced at a Washington press conference that Robert Gallo was the discoverer of the AIDS virus.
First, the probable cause of AIDS has been found, a variant of a known human cancer virus called HTLV-3. In particular, credit must go to our eminent Dr. Robert Gallo, chief of the National Cancer Institute Laboratory of Tumor Cell Biology, thank you, who directed the research that produced this discovery.
Thank you, Secretary. I should start and be brief, but first by saying that there are obviously other major contributors, and in our own group, I have to mention
Dr. Gallo didn't acknowledge what he had been told in Paris, that the French virus and test were probably the same as his.
If it turns out to be the same, I certainly will say so, and I will say so with them in a collaboration. And we think the 2 laboratories are very likely to come together, although I cannot say at this point whether the viruses are identical.
For me, it was very bad to accept. I mean, I did not recognize very easily, you know. And it was very, very difficult because you know that during 1 year and a half you are fighting to be accepted, to tell the people, to tell in the conference, to tell the scientists, we are right, we have the virus, be careful, you are wrong and wrong. And 1 year and a half after, somebody say, this guy or this person is the discoverer of the AIDS virus. I mean, that was very difficult to live that, you know.
I remember we had at the Pasteur Institute the visit of Mrs. Heckler. She wanted to see us, and so we had some nice talk. She left, and 1 week later we heard that the Gallo's patent was accepted, which was also a surprise because normally it takes more time for the American administration to issue patents. So it was very quick, and we were very disappointed that our patent was not accepted or issued at the same time or before. So that's also made us thinking that something was wrong in that.
The American lawyers took the French complaint to the nation's capital. They arranged a meeting with senior officials of the Department of Health and Human Services, the department which oversees the NIH.
We relied upon attorneys to evaluate these claims very carefully. The NIH attorneys looked at the evidence that was presented to them. The evidence that Dr. Gallo and the National Institutes of Health scientists presented documented their claim that, one, they had independently looked at the AIDS virus and discovered it. That was the first conclusion that they came to. They felt that we had a legal claim that could be argued in court, upon which we had a good chance of winning. The attorneys privately said that they had great concerns about the credibility of the documentation that had been provided to them because there were apparent discrepancies that may not be discoverable in a court proceeding, but from the standpoint of looking at the integrity of the process, they had grave concerns about it.
Meanwhile, in New York, a uniquely American process had started. The lawyers representing the Institut Pasteur did something they couldn't have done in France, and they certainly couldn't have done in Britain. They used the American Freedom of Information Act and requested copies of Gallo's team's lab notes for the period in question. The lab was obliged to hand the copies over. They were not obliged to give help in understanding them. The papers arrived in disarray, and it took a while to interpret them. But what they revealed eventually was of great interest. Gallo had claimed that he knew little of the sample he had been sent of Bru's virus, known as LAV. Sometimes he said that the culture had died. But the notes tell a different story. There were numerous references to attempts to grow it since 1983. The notes are not in his hand, and with a large laboratory staff, he would not necessarily know the detail of all the experiments being done. In one instance, the lawyers had obtained 2 copies of the same letter, one from Gallo and one from another part of NIH. A comparison showed that references to LAV had been deleted from the other copy. An anonymous telephone caller also told the lawyers that the photograph of a virus in one of Gallo's key papers was in fact a picture of the French virus taken in his lab. Whether this occurred by accident, as Gallo claims, or by design, we do not know.
Clearly, they were trying to reproduce our results without telling a word. And that was a little shocking, I would say, because when you give some material to some people, you will expect they will give you some news about what they are going to do with it and what result they got.
We had the virus growing in Atlanta, but Bob said that he had never been able to grow it at NCI, so he really didn't have any. When people ask him, isn't this French virus, he would say, well, I really don't know because the virus they sent me was dead. In reality, everyone knows he was growing huge amounts of the virus.
He was incensed that there would be a question about his scientific integrity. He was furious with the French. As he sat in my office, he told me that the French were trying to steal away the Nobel Prize from him, and that even though there may be questions raised about the chain of custody of the virus and the procedures that were used, that those were all lies, and that he could attest to the fact that there was nothing done with the French virus, nothing. And he pounded the table when he did it.
The Department of Health had a number of questions they wanted answered in preparation for a possible legal battle. They told the NIH to conduct its own investigation. They did so, and produced a report which backed Dr. Gallo and the Department of Health's patent claim. The report was never published, but we do know that it missed a vital development that was beginning to emerge at that time. As scientists around the world began to study more and more examples of the viruses from different AIDS patients, they found that the virus was remarkably variable. Its genetic makeup changed radically from patient to patient, even from the same patient at different times. It was as if everyone with AIDS had a virus with distinct markings. There was one exception. As scientists looked at the original samples of Bru's virus, which was the basis of the French test, and the virus which was used for Gallo's HTLV-3 test, they seemed to be remarkably similar. Studies of the DNA structure of the two viruses showed that, in fact, they have only a 1% difference in chemical composition. The normal difference is 30 or even 40%. This made it clear that the two labs had been using viruses which came from the same sample. An explanation for this, which immediately presents itself, is that Dr. Gallo's original samples had become contaminated by Bru's virus. Contamination is a common problem in virology.
As the molecular biochemists started looking at it, they looked at the LAV isolate and the HTLV-3 isolate by the actual gene sequence of the viruses, and not only showed that they were identical, but they were so identical that they looked like exactly the same isolate compared to other viruses that were taken from other specimens. And so then the question was, not only was the French virus and the American virus the same family of virus or the same subfamily or brothers and sisters, so it was the same cause of AIDS, but what was more shocking in this, they look like exactly out of the same test tube. And that's where the issue of, quote, contamination comes from in Bob Gallo's lab. So not only did he claim to have the cause of AIDS when he knew that the French had discovered it before, two, that he said his virus was different and it should be his name, HTLV-3, it turns out that the actual very test tube isolate of virus that he has turns out to be the one the French sent him in the mail.
Dr. Gallo now accepts that the two viruses are the same, and that his test was in reality based on the French virus, and that it was probably a contamination. This raises the question of who really discovered the cause of AIDS. This question would probably have been examined in a court case over the patent assignment. But there never was a court case.
Well, the determination we finally came to after investigating it was that Bob Gallo, as strong as he was on his views, couldn't support the claims he was making from a legal standpoint. And so our attorneys recommended, the department attorneys, perhaps in some conflict with the NIH attorneys, recommended that we fold, that we roll over, but play it out until we saw how strong the French were on it. But our strategy was play it out as strong as we could, but if we got to the point where we knew we were going to court, that we should roll over to accept a reconciliation and settlement of this problem. The French attorneys, the attorneys representing the French government, didn't know how weak our case was. and they never discovered it. And so we were able to craft an agreement that probably disadvantaged the French, but it was because we hid our weakness fairly effectively.
We in the United States and France have very, very good and efficient scientists, and they will now work together and also create a foundation to fight against AIDS.
In 1987, President Ronald Reagan and the mayor of Paris, also a French presidential candidate, Jacques Chirac, ratified an agreement between the Institut Pasteur and the Department of Health.
We felt, in a political sense, that it was important for President Reagan to show that he had an interest in the AIDS problem. It was an inexpensive fix because it cost the government no money. Working out a deal with the French from a political standpoint was beneficial both to the French government because their president was running for election. Reagan had a growing problem of insensitivity to people who had this affliction of AIDS. This offered a major advance in identifying people who would be afflicted by it and potentially offering the pathway for the discovery of a cure. And so we were pushing very hard to make sure that the president and that the French could come to a geopolitical press conference announcement to allow them to get the political benefits of it.
A week before the agreement, Gallo and Montagnier had met in a hotel room in Frankfurt. They had thrashed out between them an official history of the discovery of the virus. This was the basis of the agreement. The history gave equal credit to both institutions. Care was even taken that each institution and each team were mentioned an equal number of times. Few scientists would now question that the official history misrepresented the truth. But it still is the official history, and Professor Gallo and Professor Montagnier both signed it.
Well, of course, I had some thinking about that, but I think at that time, finally I concluded it was the best we could get. And also there was an important issue with that AIDS research, and AIDS research could be damaged by continued fighting between two people or two laboratories involved in the field. So I think it was a good thing to have this agreement in 1987. I think closed for some time the discussion and the dispute.
Dr. Gallo was furious that we had entered into what he called a political solution invading the scientific area. He maintained that he deserved the credit for exclusively for the development of the AIDS virus, identification of the AIDS virus. He felt that we were selling him out and selling down the river his opportunity to be recognized in the community for having made this major scientific accomplishment. He ignored the questions which we raised with him, legitimate questions about our ability to defend this action in the lawsuit, and said that we were simply making a political judgment in order to resolve a problem that had nothing to do with his scientific ability.
Part of the agreement was also that neither side was to engage in any further discussion of the matter. Dr. Gallo has never given an interview on the subject. NIH did not allow him to speak to this program. The matter was closed. And it might very well have remained closed, were it not for a single sequence of events. Events involving the world of journalism. Just before the agreement in 1987, the story had been investigated and told in the British magazine New Scientist. The article didn't pull its punches, but there was little reaction in the scientific establishment. Nothing more happened until in 1989, the Chicago Tribune published a 30-page article about the whole story. John Crewdson, a journalist who had worked on the Watergate hearings, had read the New Scientist piece and spent 3 years investigating it. He had produced an article of such technical detail that it was almost impossible for a non-specialist to read. But it got through to one group of specialists. The Congressional Committee on Oversight and Investigation, headed by Congressman John Dingell, investigates allegations of scientific misconduct. NIH was well known to the committee, and Dingell's unique style was well known to NIH. When he started investigations on a case of misconduct a couple of years earlier, he addressed a group of NIH scientists with these words.
Now, I don't want you to get the impression that this committee is going to stage a one-day hearing, bring you up and make you miserable, and then let you go on about your business. When we do these things, we try to see to it that the pain and suffering goes on for a greater period of time until the abuse that is obvious is addressed.
The Dingell Committee did not conduct its own investigations this time. Instead, it sent word to the NIH that it should investigate the matter again. The job was given to a department of NIH called the Office of Scientific Integrity. The chief investigator for the case was Suzanne Hadley.
At the beginning, we were watched closely by the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. I always was aware we had to prove ourselves. I believe that we had established our credibility with the subcommittee. Not by any means that they were unequivocally thrilled with our performance, but they knew there was a commitment. They knew we were making a real attempt to be effective, and there was confidence there.
She had gained the confidence of the Dingell Committee, but she feels that she was facing an uphill struggle in an organization unused to the process of self-examination.
There is an attitude that is prevailing now. I hope it is not characteristic of NIH as an institution. That attitude involves an obsession almost with procedures, with making sure that things are done in a particular way. And frankly, it seems to me that there is an extraordinary blind spot and a lack of awareness, almost a pushing away of awareness of the possibility that there may have been serious wrongdoing.
Eventually, Hadley felt that her position was untenable and resigned. Last week, leaks of the as yet unpublished report appeared in the press. It clears Gallo of formal misconduct, although one member dissents from this verdict. The report still doesn't seem to resolve the question of contamination versus misappropriation. Dr. Gallo is still energetically defending his position. The arguments are far from over.
Well, ultimately, I would like that science take care of its own house, and science should judge the ethics and the scientific standards of its own people. Unfortunately, with the power that Bob Gallo yields, he scared almost everyone who wanted to criticize him out of the field. I mean, most of this was known by us in the field 1984, and here we are talking about 1992, the better part of a decade later. If science is not going to take care of their house, then somebody else better do it.
The Dingell Committee may not be writing a report on the matter, but they may yet have the final influence in the story. They are known to have set in motion a criminal investigation relating to the sworn statements made by Dr. Gallo in support of the patent award. The Institut Pasteur is pursuing its claim. They feel the agreement that gives equal credit to both labs is now discredited. They are demanding $20 million, the amount earned by the American government from the patent of Dr. Gallo's test. But even if the Pasteur does achieve this, the cost to the French scientists will have been considerable.
Jean-Claude ended up leaving and going to Marseille and setting up his lab, and François Barré has an independent lab at the Institut Pasteur. So they really are not a very close group anymore. Again, that's a sign of what happens when this conflict comes. Same thing happened to CDC. Our laboratory totally auto-destructed over the years. I left, everyone else left, and it's essentially no one there who was in the beginning. It was an unpleasant field. Why do you stay in an unpleasant field? Go find something else to do.